If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. The Mendoza Aerospace hangar in Farnborough buzzed with tension that October afternoon. The enormous warehouse, usually noisy with the sound of tools and technical voices, was filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by nervous whispers and the occasional clang of metal against metal. At the center of it all, an imposing E-195 aircraft engine rested like a metallic enigma that challenged the company's best engineers. Edward Mendoza, founder and president of the United Kingdom's second-largest aircraft manufacturer, checked his gold watch for the 5th time in under 10 minutes. His impeccable navy blue suit contrasted with the industrial environment and the exhausted expressions of the engineers around him. The delivery of that engine was due the next day, and an inexplicable fault continued to plague the tests. "How much longer?" Edward asked, his deep voice echoing through the hangar. "Sir, we've tried every conventional hypothesis," replied Claude, the head of the maintenance team, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's something we're not seeing." Mendoza Aerospace had secured a landmark contract with the country's largest airline, but that defect threatened not only the delivery deadline, but also the reputation built over 3 decades. The businessman ran his fingers through his perfectly trimmed beard, mentally calculating the financial and reputational damage that the delay would cause. It was at this critical moment that something unexpected happened. The side doors of the hangar opened, letting in a ray of sunshine and the silhouette of a young woman in a wheelchair. She advanced with determination, her dark, curly hair swaying with each movement. Her simple, worn clothes contrasted with the professional environment. Her hands, visibly calloused and stained with grease, gripped the wheels of her chair firmly. 2 security guards immediately approached, but she was already close enough for everyone to hear her. "I can help with that engine," she announced with surprising conviction, her eyes fixed on the turbine. Her voice was firm, without hesitation. An even deeper silence fell over the hangar, followed by nervous laughter from the engineers. Victoria Nash, at 28, was unfazed by the reaction. She was already accustomed to skepticism. "How did you get in here?" asked one of the security guards, stepping between her and the group. "The service door was open," she replied simply. "I heard about the engine problem. It's the whistling during landing and the difficulty restarting after shutdown, isn't it?" Claude's eyes widened, surprised by the accuracy of the description. "How do you know that?" Before she could answer, Edward Mendoza raised his hand, silencing everyone. Something in the young woman's confidence had captured his attention. "Let her speak," he ordered, approaching with renewed interest. Victoria maintained an upright posture in her chair. "I've worked with similar systems before. From the description I overheard from the technicians at the entrance, it sounds like a resonance problem combined with a sensor system failure." Edward studied the young woman for a few seconds. His instinct, which rarely betrayed him in business, told him there was something special there. "Give her the necessary tools," he determined, ignoring the incredulous glances of his team. "Sir, with all due respect, we cannot allow an unaccredited person—" The security supervisor began to protest. "We're out of options, Maurice," Edward cut in. "Let's hear what she has to say." Reluctantly, the engineers stepped back, making way for Victoria to approach the engine. She put on the gloves offered and, with impressive agility, strategically positioned her chair around the turbine, examining each component with an analytical eye. "What brings you here exactly?" Edward asked, observing her with growing curiosity. Victoria continued her methodical inspection as she replied, "I spent 5 years studying aerospace engineering at the Cambridge Institute of Aeronautics. Whenever I can, I come to this hangar. It reminds me of who I used to be." Something in the way she pronounced "used to be" sent a shiver down Edward's spine. There was a story in that phrase, a story he intuited to be as complex as the engine before them. "Found it," she exclaimed suddenly after 15 minutes of careful examination. "There are 2 problems that mask each other. A misplaced retaining clamp in the combustion chamber is causing vibration at a specific frequency, hence the whistling. And there's a wire with damaged insulation near the temperature sensor which confuses the reading during cooling." Claude approached, skeptical. "Impossible. We checked all the clamps and the electrical wiring." "You checked them separately," Victoria corrected. "The problem only appears when the 2 defects interact. If you'll allow me." Edward nodded, and the team, still suspicious, provided the requested tools. With surgical precision, Victoria worked on repositioning the clamp, then rebuilt the wire's insulation and repositioned it away from the friction area. 17 minutes, Edward announced, looking at his watch when she finished. Is that your record? A discreet smile appeared on Victoria's face. Actually, I've done it in 15, but never with such an audience. The engine was prepared for testing. When the control panel lit up and a fault alarm flashed, the engineers prepared to interrupt the procedure. Wait, Victoria intervened. It's just the system recalibrating after the modification. Give it 30 seconds. Edward gestured for them to continue. Exactly 27 seconds later, the red light went out, and the engine started with a perfect rumble without any whistling or irregularity. The hangar erupted in subdued applause and admiring glances. Victoria remained calm, as if it were just another normal day at work. Do you have a name, our mysterious savior? Edward asked, extending his hand. Victoria Nash, she replied, returning the handshake with a firm grip. One of the older engineers stepped forward, his eyes wide in recognition. Wait, Victoria Nash from the Cambridge Institute of Aeronautics, the prodigy student who won the National Innovation Award in 2019? Edward noticed that Victoria's silence was a confirmation. What happened to you? He asked, now genuinely intrigued. Her eyes lost their sparkle for an instant, fixing on a distant point. Life, Mr. Mendoza, simply life. At that moment, something changed in the businessman's gaze. It wasn't just admiration for the technical talent he had just witnessed, but a deeper, almost familial connection. I think we need to talk, he said, gesturing for them to follow him to his office in the building annexed to the hangar. As Victoria maneuvered her chair through the corridors of Mendoza Aerospace, she had no idea that 17-minute repair was about to completely redirect the course of her existence. Edward Mendoza's office reflected the businessman's personality, imposing, organized, and offering a prime view of the Mendoza Aerospace Industrial Complex. Through the glass windows, the hangars and test runways stretched out until they met the Chiltern Hills on the horizon. Victoria observed everything with a mixture of admiration and nostalgia. Coffee? Edward offered as he settled behind the imposing rosewood desk. Yes, please, with sugar, she replied, positioning her wheelchair in front of the desk. A secretary entered silently, served the cups and withdrew, leaving them alone. Edward studied Victoria for a few moments before beginning. So you are the legendary Victoria Nash from the Cambridge Institute of Aeronautics. Engineer Matthew recognized you immediately. She gave an awkward smile. Legendary is an exaggeration. I was just a good student. A good student doesn't solve in minutes a problem that baffled my entire team for 3 days, he countered. What happened? Why is someone with your talent missing, unemployed, in a wheelchair? She completed, with a frankness that surprised the businessman. Those are too many questions for one afternoon, Mr. Mendoza. Edward leaned back in his chair, acknowledging the delicate territory. Start wherever you prefer. Victoria took a deep breath, like someone preparing to lift a long-held burden. I was in my final year of university when my parents were in a motorway accident. We didn't have adequate health insurance, and the hospital bills consumed all our savings. I dropped out of university to care for them. She paused, sipping her coffee to hide her emotion. Edward remained in respectful silence. After they recovered, my accident happened. A silly fall at home. Incomplete spinal cord injury. The doctors said I could regain movement with intensive physical therapy, but... She shrugged. That costs money I don't have. And what about your degree? You were in your final year, right? I only had 3 months left, but life had other plans. I tried to go back later, but circumstances... She gestured vaguely. I live with my parents in a housing estate in Satellite Gardens. I work as a freelance technical consultant when I find opportunities, but without a degree they're rare. Edward got up and walked to the window, watching the movement of planes on the runway. Victoria noticed a framed photograph on the wall, a smiling middle-aged woman wearing a gold bracelet. My wife Eliza, he explained, noticing Victoria's gaze. She passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry, she murmured. She used to say that talents like yours are too rare to be wasted, Edward continued, turning back to Victoria. Do you know the name of our new executive jet project? E-30 Phoenix. Do you know why? Victoria smiled. The bird that rises from the ashes. Exactly. I believe in second chances, Victoria, and I think you deserve one. What followed was a conversation that would change the course of Victoria's life. Edward proposed a daring plan: to take her on the company's private jet to Mendoza Aerospace's headquarters in London, where she would participate in an emergency meeting with the board of directors and key engineers. The new executive jet was having problems with its flight control system, and Edward was convinced that Victoria could help. "It's an opportunity for you to show your worth," he explained. "If you can impress them as you did me today, I can guarantee your life will change completely." "Why are you doing this for me?" Victoria asked, genuinely confused by the sudden generosity. Edward hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say I'm paying an old debt. To the universe, perhaps." 3 hours later, Victoria found herself aboard Mendoza Aerospace's luxurious private jet, flying over the English countryside heading to London. The sensation was surreal. That morning, she had left home determined to just peek into the company's hangar, as she occasionally did to rekindle her passion for engineering. Now she was flying to a meeting that could transform her life. "Enjoying the view?" Edward asked, taking the seat opposite her. "It's incredible," she confessed, watching the orange sunset paint the clouds. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Mendoza." "Edward, please. And don't thank me yet. The hard part is yet to come." During the flight, Edward explained the situation in London. The Phoenix project was delayed due to problems with the fly-by-wire electronic flight control system. The engineering team was divided on the solution, and time was running out. "The regional director, Richard Alistair, is brilliant, but extremely traditional," Edward warned. "He won't be happy to see an unknown, degreeless person brought in to solve a problem his team couldn't." Victoria nodded, understanding the challenge. "I'm used to skepticism." As the jet began its descent for landing in London, Edward pulled something from his pocket, a delicate gold bracelet with a small phoenix-shaped charm. "It was Eliza's," he explained, extending the jewelry to Victoria. "She wore it as a talisman of strength in difficult times. I'd like you to wear it today." Victoria accepted the gift with trembling hands, deeply touched by the gesture. "I don't know if I can accept something so personal." "I'm not giving it," Edward clarified with an enigmatic smile. "I'm lending it. For now." Upon disembarking in London, they were met by a tense delegation. Richard Alistair, a man in his 50s with a severe expression, made no effort to hide his disapproval at seeing Victoria. "Edward, with all due respect, we are in the middle of a technical crisis. This is not the time for social initiatives," he murmured, stepping back a few paces. "Richard, I know your competence, but I also know how to recognize talent when I see it," Edward countered firmly. "Victoria just solved a complex problem in Farnborough that baffled your team for days. Give her a chance." Mendoza Aerospace's engineering center in London was even more impressive than the hangar in Farnborough. A vast space with flight simulators, full-scale models, and dozens of engineers working at computerized workstations. Victoria was led to the problem. The E-30 Phoenix simulator exhibited erratic behavior during specific maneuvers, and no one could identify whether it was a software or hardware failure. A group of executives and senior engineers observed, most clearly skeptical. "How much time do you need?" Richard asked, the challenge evident in his voice. Victoria looked at the golden bracelet on her wrist, feeling an inexplicable wave of confidence. 1 hour in the simulator. 1 more hour to propose the solution. 2 hours? Richard laughed, incredulous. "We've had PhDs on this problem for weeks." "Then you have nothing to lose, do you?" Victoria replied calmly. "Except 2 hours of your time." Edward smiled discreetly, recognizing in the young engineer the same determination that had led him to found Mendoza Aerospace 3 decades earlier, against all odds. 2 hours, Richard agreed, looking at his watch. "And then we'll decide if this was a waste of time or not." As Victoria was led to the simulator, Edward briefly stopped her. "Remember, it's not just about fixing a plane, it's about reclaiming your place in the world." Victoria's eyes shone with renewed determination. "Don't worry, I know exactly what's at stake." And so, under the watchful eye of a room full of skeptics, Victoria Nash began her journey back to engineering, to dignity and to herself. The E-30 Phoenix simulator was a complex system that faithfully reproduced the cockpit of Mendoza Aerospace's new executive jet. Victoria strategically positioned her chair and began to work, her fingers gliding with precision over the controls. The engineers watched through the glass, most still skeptical, some curious. "Do you really think she'll find something we haven't seen?" one of the executives whispered to Richard. "I highly doubt it," replied the regional director, his arms crossed in a clear display of skepticism. "Edward has always had this tendency to bet on underdogs. Sometimes he gets it right, but this time—" For a full hour, Victoria performed specific maneuvers, recording data, making quick notes, and occasionally requesting changes to the simulator's settings. The silence in the observation room was palpable, broken only by the sound of commands being actuated and the soft hum of the equipment. Edward observed not only Victoria, but also the team's reactions. He knew those looks well. He had been on the other side, being judged when he founded the company with minimal capital and maximum dreams. At 52 minutes into the simulation, something unexpected happened. Victoria executed an unconventional sequence of commands that made the panel indicators flash erratically. She smiled as if she had finally found the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle. "Can I access the source code of the fly-by-wire system?" she asked over the intercom. Richard hesitated, exchanging glances with the software engineers. "That's highly confidential material," he protested. "We can't just—" "Provide access," Edward interrupted with authority. "If she signs the confidentiality agreement, there's no problem." The following minutes were of intense activity. Victoria alternated between examining lines of code and returning to the simulator to test hypotheses. Her face showed absolute concentration, as if the world around her had disappeared. Exactly 2 hours after starting as promised, Victoria activated the intercom. "I'm ready to present my conclusions." The conference room was packed. In addition to executives and engineers, other employees had gathered, attracted by rumors about the mysterious engineer, in a wheelchair brought in by the company president himself. Victoria positioned her chair at the head of the table, connected her tablet to the projection system, and took a deep breath. The golden bracelet on her wrist gleamed under the room's lights, a silent reminder of what was at stake. "The E30 Phoenix problem is not just a software bug or a hardware failure," she began in a clear voice. "It's an incompatibility between 3 systems that individually work perfectly, but which under specific conditions enter into conflict." She projected technical diagrams she had prepared during her analysis, explaining how the inertial navigation system, altitude control, and aerodynamic compensation system created a negative feedback loop under certain flight conditions. The fault only manifests when 3 specific conditions occur simultaneously: altitude above 30,000 feet, bank angle greater than 15 degrees, and decelerating speed, she continued. "That's why it only appeared in the final tests and proved so elusive." Richard Alistair, who had started the presentation with a skeptical expression, now leaned forward, visibly interested. The other engineers exchanged impressed glances, some furiously taking notes. "My proposal is to implement an intermediate software layer that harmonizes communication between these systems," Victoria continued, projecting elegant code she had written during her analysis. "It requires no hardware changes, just a firmware update that can be implemented in 3 days." When she finished the presentation, the silence in the room was revealing. It was no longer the silence of skepticism, but of professional admiration. Victoria had not only identified the problem, but had offered an elegant solution that would save weeks of work and millions of pounds. Edward Mendoza smiled discreetly, observing the expressions around the table. He knew when a battle had been won. "Any objection to the proposed solution?" he asked, addressing Richard specifically. The regional director hesitated, clearly torn between his professional pride and his admiration for the work he had just witnessed. "We need to validate the code, of course, but the analysis seems solid." Coming from Richard, that was practically an ovation. "Excellent," Edward concluded, standing up. "Richard, I want your team to implement Ms. Nash's solution immediately and prepare a contract. As of today, Victoria is our special consultant on the Phoenix project." The news dropped like a bombshell in the room. Victoria's eyes widened, surprised by the unexpected development. "Consultant?" Richard repeated, paling. "Edward, with all due respect, there are procedures for hires at this level and—" "Procedures that I created and can adapt when necessary," Edward cut in with diplomatic firmness. "Besides, I'm not suggesting a permanent hire yet. It's a project-based consultancy to start." The words "to start" hung in the air like a promise. Behind the scenes, while the engineers eagerly discussed the implementation of the solution, Edward led Victoria to his temporary office in London. The room, smaller than the one in Farnborough, maintained the same austere elegance. "You were brilliant," he praised, pouring her a glass of water. "You exceeded my expectations, which is not easy." Victoria still seemed to be processing the events of the last few hours. "Phoenix project consultant. It's surreal." "It's just the beginning," Edward assured her. "There's a flight tomorrow morning to Farnborough. I'd like you to return with me. There's someone I want you to meet." "Who?" "My son, Theo. He will oversee the implementation of your solution, as Richard will be busy with the launch of the new line of regional jets. You'll work together." Before they could continue, the door opened and Richard entered, his demeanor more composed, but still tense. "The engineers are excited about the solution," he admitted. "Congratulations, Ms. Nash. It was impressive." The reluctant compliment brought a discreet smile to Victoria's face. "Thank you, Mr. Alistair. Your team is excellent. I just brought a different perspective to the problem." The diplomatic response seemed to soothe the director's wounded pride somewhat. "Well, while everyone celebrates, there are practical matters to resolve. Where are you staying in London, Ms. Nash?" Victoria exchanged a quick glance with Edward. "Actually, I just arrived. I haven't had time to—" "I'll arrange a room at the Grand Hotel," Edward interrupted. "We'll leave early for Farnborough tomorrow." When Richard left, Victoria looked at Edward with eyes full of unasked questions. "Why are you doing all this for me? You don't owe me anything." Edward sighed, sitting on the edge of the desk. "My wife, Eliza, was an engineer, brilliant like you. When she fell ill, her greatest frustration wasn't the illness itself, but having to abandon her projects, her innovations." He paused, looking at the bracelet on Victoria's wrist. "Her last wish was for me to create a foundation to support talent in difficult situations. When I saw you in the hangar today, I knew immediately that Eliza would have loved to meet you." The confession touched Victoria deeply. "I'm honored to wear her bracelet." "She believed that objects carry the energy of those who possess them," Edward smiled. "She said this bracelet had the power to restore broken wings." That night, alone in the luxurious hotel room, Victoria contemplated the bracelet in the light of the bedside lamp. The last 24 hours had transformed her life in unimaginable ways. From an existence on the fringes of the engineering she loved, she was now at the center of one of the most important projects of the country's second-largest aircraft manufacturer. She picked up the phone and called home. Her mother's emotional voice on the other end of the line almost made her cry. "Mum, you won't believe what happened today," she began, her voice choked with emotion. "I think I'm finally flying again." Meanwhile, in his own hotel room, Edward Mendoza made a call to Farnborough. "Theo, I'm bringing someone special tomorrow, an extraordinary engineer who will work on the Phoenix project. I want you to personally supervise her integration." He paused, listening to his son's reply. "Yes, I'm sure she reminds me of your mother in many ways. I think you two will get along very well." As he hung up, Edward looked out the window at the starry London sky. For the first time since Eliza's passing, he felt he was truly honoring her memory, not just through the foundation that bore her name, but by reconnecting a talented engineer with her purpose. The sun had barely risen when Mendoza Aerospace's private jet took off from London, heading to Farnborough. Victoria watched the clouds through the oval window, still processing the turnaround in her life. In just 2 days, she had gone from a forgotten engineer to a special consultant on one of the country's largest aeronautical projects. "Did you sleep well?" Edward asked, taking the seat opposite her with a folder of documents. "Honestly, I barely slept," Victoria confessed with a smile. "My mind wouldn't stop working on possible enhancements for the Phoenix system." Edward smiled, recognizing the characteristic enthusiasm of true innovators. "That's exactly why we need you. Here are the documents for your consultancy contract. 6 initial months with the possibility of extension or permanent employment." Victoria leafed through the papers, her eyes widening at the remuneration amount. "This is much more than I expected." "It's a fair value for your talent," he replied simply. "I've also included an advance to cover immediate expenses." "I know you mentioned physical therapy." She swallowed hard, too emotional to respond adequately. After a few seconds, she managed to murmur, "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." "Repay me by making the Phoenix fly perfectly," Edward replied, leaning back in the comfortable leather seat. "Oh, and there's another benefit not listed in the contract. Mendoza owns apartments for special employees in Farnborough. 5 minutes from the company. One of them will be yours during the project." Victoria signed the documents with trembling hands. In 2 days, she had solved not only the engine and fly-by-wire system problems, but also her own most urgent issues: housing, medical treatment, and a return to the profession she loved. "Edward, can I ask you a personal question?" she ventured after returning the signed papers. "Of course." "Your son, Theo, what's he like?" Edward smiled enigmatically. "You'll find out soon, but I can tell you that he inherited his mother's talent for engineering, and unfortunately a bit of my stubbornness." The rest of the flight proceeded with technical discussions about the Phoenix project. When they finally landed in Farnborough, Victoria felt a strange mixture of apprehension and excitement, as if she were returning home after a long absence. In the main hangar, a tall figure awaited the jet's arrival. Theo Mendoza was 32, with dark, carefully disheveled hair and the same penetrating eyes as his father. He wore a blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing a sophisticated watch on his left wrist. "Welcome back, Dad," he greeted, briefly hugging Edward before turning his attention to Victoria. "And you must be the miracle engineer who solved our problems in London." There was a slight tone of irony in his voice that did not escape Victoria's notice. "Victoria Nash," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "And I don't believe in miracles, only in well-applied physics and mathematics." Theo raised his eyebrows, surprised by her direct response. He shook her hand with renewed firmness, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. "Theo will show you your accommodations and the lab where you'll work," Edward explained. "I have a video conference with investors in 15 minutes, but we'll meet for dinner, all 3 of us." As Edward walked away, a momentary silence fell between Victoria and Theo. "So," he began, walking beside her wheelchair toward the parking lot, "my father rarely gets so impressed with someone that he offers a contract on the same day. What exactly did you do to win him over?" "I fixed what no one else could," Victoria replied simply. "Both here and in London." Theo led her to a car adapted with hand controls. "I thought you'd prefer to drive. My father mentioned your condition is temporary." The thoughtful gesture caught Victoria by surprise. "Thank you. I really prefer to have autonomy." The apartment designated for Victoria was modern and fully adapted for accessibility. Located in a complex near the company, it offered views of the Chiltern Hills and all the comfort she hadn't experienced in years. "This is incredible," she murmured, exploring the spacious rooms and the details specifically designed for her needs. "We adapted everything last night after my father called," Theo explained, observing her with growing interest. "The team worked late." Victoria stopped by the large living room window, contemplating the view. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Theo approached, stopping beside her. "My father always says that exceptional talents deserve exceptional opportunities, but I confess I'm curious to see if you're really as good as he believes." The implicit challenge did not escape Victoria's perception. "You'll have your answer soon," she replied confidently. "When do we start?" "How about now? The Phoenix lab is in the main building. Your team is already implementing the changes you proposed in London, but there are other subsystems that need optimization." 2 hours later, Victoria was immersed in the environment she loved most, a state-of-the-art aerospace engineering laboratory. The walls were covered with screens displaying flight simulations, telemetry data, and technical diagrams. Engineers and technicians moved with purpose, and the air vibrated with the energy of innovation. Theo introduced her to the team as the specialist who solved the fly-by-wire problem. The initially skeptical glances soon turned into professional respect, as Victoria began discussing complex technical aspects with impressive ease. "We need to adjust the environmental control system," she explained, analyzing data on one of the screens. "It's consuming 12% more energy than designed, which will affect flight range." Theo crossed his arms, watching her work. "Richard already tried to optimize this system 3 times. The conclusion was that we'd need a complete redesign." Victoria smiled, her fingers gliding over the keyboard with impressive speed. "Sometimes the problem isn't in the hardware, but in the control logic. Look at this." She projected a new algorithm for the system onto the main screen, explaining how the current approach wasted energy in redundant cycles. The proposed solution was elegant, and more importantly implementable without physical alterations to the prototype. "This might work," Theo admitted, clearly impressed despite his initial reluctance. "Let's simulate it." The following hours flew by as they worked side by side, refining the algorithm and running simulations. The initial tension between them gradually transformed into a productive dynamic. Theo was methodically precise, examining every detail with meticulous attention. Victoria was intuitive and creative, finding unexpected solutions to complex problems. 9.7% reduction in energy consumption, he finally announced, analyzing the simulation results. Without compromising cabin comfort or system safety. Impressive. Victoria smiled, satisfied. "We can still improve. With a few more iterations, we'll reach 15%. Don't you get tired?" Theo asked, checking his watch. It was past 8 in the evening, and they had worked continuously. "Of engineering?" "Never," she replied sincerely. "I spent 2 years away from it. Every minute here is like breathing again after being submerged for a long time." Something in the way she spoke touched Theo. For the first time, he looked at her not as an intruder brought in by his father, but as a colleague passionate about the same field as him. "My father is waiting for us for dinner," he reminded her, shutting down his terminal. "And for the first time in years, I'm actually curious to hear what he has to say." The restaurant chosen by Edward was high up in the hills, offering a panoramic view of the illuminated city. Elegant without being ostentatious, it was clearly a place where the businessman was well known. "So," Edward began after they had ordered, "how was the first day of working together?" "Productive," Theo replied. Victoria optimized the environmental control system that Richard had considered a lost cause, and Theo identified a potential vulnerability in the backup system that even I hadn't noticed, Victoria added, surprising the young engineer with the public acknowledgement. Edward smiled, pleased with the evident professional chemistry that was beginning to develop. "Excellent. Richard called from London today. The implementation of your solution for the fly-by-wire was a complete success. The first simulated flight tests ran without any anomalies, and he admitted that voluntarily?" Theo asked, incredulous. "Well, in his own way," Edward laughed. "He said that Ms. Nash's unconventional approach proved suitable for the specific problem." The three laughed, recognizing the regional director's reluctant compliment. The conversation flowed naturally during dinner, transitioning from technical topics to personal stories. Victoria spoke about her years at the Cambridge Institute of Aeronautics, the robotics competitions she won, and the projects she had developed before her forced hiatus from engineering. Theo, in turn, shared experiences from his education at MIT and the challenges of working at his father's company. "People always assume I have everything easy because I'm the owner's son," he confided. "In fact, Edward has always demanded more from me than from any other employee." "It's because I know what you're capable of," Edward replied with paternal affection. As they savored dessert, Victoria noticed a different glint in Theo's eyes when he looked at her. It was no longer the initial skepticism, nor even the professional respect earned during the workday. It was something more personal, warmer. "Tomorrow we have a meeting with the Aeronautical Certification Committee," Edward informed them, checking his phone calendar. "They have specific concerns about the Phoenix that we need to address. Victoria, I'd like you to participate." "Me?" She was surprised. "I thought this type of meeting was only for directors and indispensable technical specialists," Edward completed. "What you've demonstrated in the last 2 days fully qualifies you." At the end of the evening, as Edward said goodbye to take an international call, Theo offered to drive Victoria back to her apartment. You know, I was prepared not to like you," he admitted, as he drove through the illuminated streets of Farnborough. "I noticed," she smiled. "What changed?" Theo reflected for a moment. "I saw the way you look at problems, not as obstacles but as challenges to overcome. It's rare to find someone like that." When they arrived at the complex, he walked her to the apartment door. A moment of silence, charged with meaning, hung between them. "Thank you for today," Victoria finally said, "for giving me a real chance to prove my worth." "Thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with engineering," he replied, his gaze meeting hers with increasing intensity. That night, as Victoria prepared for bed in her new home, Eliza's golden bracelet resting on the bedside table, she reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few days. From a life of limitations and lost opportunities, She was now at the center of one of the most important projects in British aviation, and to her surprise, she was beginning to feel something she had long given up on, the hope for a future that included not only professional fulfillment, but also the possibility of personal connection. The following weeks brought an extraordinary transformation in Victoria's life. The apartment, initially empty and impersonal, gradually acquired touches that reflected her personality. Engineering books on the shelves, a blackboard covered with equations on the living room wall, and a small collection of historical aircraft miniatures she had begun to collect. Her parents, who initially hesitated to believe in their daughter's sudden change of fortune, now visited her regularly, amazed by the new reality. Even more impressive was her physical progress. With her generous salary, Victoria began intensive physical therapy sessions 3 times a week. The doctors, impressed by her determination, confirmed the initial prognosis. Her condition was indeed temporary. Each week, small improvements were noted, a regained movement here, a restored sensation there. She began using crutches for short distances, reserving the wheelchair only for the most tiring days or long distances. In the Phoenix lab, her presence had become indispensable. What began as a special consultant role quickly evolved into a de facto, if not de jure, technical leadership position. Engineers with decades of experience now sought her opinion before finalizing important decisions. Edward frequently invited her to strategic meetings, valuing her direct and innovative perspective. But the most significant change was her relationship with Theo. What began as mutual skepticism transformed into professional respect, then genuine friendship, and now something deeper that neither of them had fully verbalized. They worked side by side daily, often being the first to arrive and the last to leave. They shared lunches discussing technical details of the project, which gradually gave way to conversations about personal dreams, favorite movies, and plans for the future. Occasionally, their hands would accidentally touch while analyzing the same diagram, creating moments of silent electricity that both pretended not to notice. On a particularly challenging Friday, when they finally managed to solve a persistent problem in the navigation system, Theo did the unexpected. He invited her for a flight. "Have you ever been in a small aircraft before?" he asked, as they walked to the parking lot at the end of the workday. "Only as a passenger," Victoria replied. "Why?" "I have a private Cessna 172, he explained with a smile. "Tomorrow the sky will be perfect. I thought maybe you'd like to see the Phoenix from a different perspective, literally." Victoria hesitated momentarily. "I don't know if I'm ready to." "You can use crutches, and I promise it will just be a gentle flight over the Thames Valley. No acrobatics." His smile was so genuinely enthusiastic that Victoria couldn't refuse. "All right. What time?" The next morning, under an intense blue sky, Theo met her at the entrance of the local aero club. Victoria used crutches, determined to walk as much as possible. She wore jeans, a light blouse, and the golden bracelet that had become her good luck charm. Theo's Cessna 172 was a classic aircraft, impeccably maintained. As he performed the pre-flight inspection, he explained every detail to Victoria, who absorbed the information with professional fascination. "It's strange," she commented, running her hand over the polished surface of the wing. "I spent years studying aircraft theoretically, designing components, but I rarely have physical contact with them like this." "Like a composer who rarely hears their own music being played," Theo suggested. "Exactly," she smiled, impressed by the analogy. The flight was revelatory for both. As they flew over the Thames Valley, Theo realized how much he admired not only Victoria's intelligence, but also her resilience and genuine passion for engineering. She, in turn, discovered a side of Theo that rarely appeared in the corporate environment, relaxed, patient, and deeply passionate about the act of flying. "Want to take the controls?" he offered when they were at 3,000 feet altitude. Victoria's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely, it's a perfect day. We're at a safe altitude, and the Cessna is extremely stable. Besides," he added with a smile, "I trust you completely." With Theo's calm guidance, Victoria gripped the yoke, feeling the aircraft respond to her commands. The sensation was indescribable, a mixture of power and delicacy, exactly like the systems she designed daily, but now translated into direct physical experience. "It's incredible," she whispered, executing a gentle right turn. I feel like I'm directly connected to every aerodynamic equation I've ever studied. That's exactly the feeling that made me want to be an aerospace engineer, Theo replied, observing her with growing admiration. Theory and practice becoming one. When they landed 2 hours later, something had changed between them. The shared flight had created an intimacy that went beyond conversations and joint work. They sat at the Aero Club cafe, discussing the experience with enthusiasm, when Theo suddenly paused. "I have a confession to make," he said, his tone becoming serious. "What is it?" Victoria asked, suddenly apprehensive. "When my father brought you to the company, I was planning to make your life difficult enough for you to give up." The confession took Victoria by surprise. "Why?" Theo sighed, clearly embarrassed. "I thought it was just one of his social projects. I thought he was bringing someone unqualified, just because of your touching personal story. I thought I'd have to correct your mistakes and you ended up discovering that I knew what I was doing," she completed, without resentment in her voice. "More than that, I discovered that you are probably the most brilliant engineer I've ever met." He paused, searching for the right words. "Victoria, I not only misjudged you, I fell in love with you." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Victoria looked at Eliza's bracelet on her wrist, then at the man in front of her, the son of the man who had restored her professional life and now, perhaps, also her personal life. "Theo, At that moment his cell phone rang insistently. It was Edward, urgently summoning them to the company. Richard Alastair had arrived from London without warning, bringing alarming news about the Phoenix project. When they arrived at Edward's office, they found Richard already seated, with a grave expression. On the table, scattered documents and a screen projecting worrying graphs. "Preliminary certification tests revealed a critical problem in the cabin pressurization system," Richard explained bluntly. "Under certain conditions, there's a risk of structural failure." "That's impossible," Theo countered. "All our tests indicated full structural integrity." "Tests under controlled conditions," Richard countered, projecting new data. "These are results from independent tests conducted by the regulatory agency." The atmosphere in the room was tense. Edward observed the data with a worried expression. "What does this mean for the project?" Victoria asked, analyzing the graphs carefully. "At the very least 6 months of delays," Richard replied. "In the worst-case scenario, a complete redesign of the fuselage." 6 months would mean losing the market window, Edward pondered, and a complete redesign would cost millions. Richard adjusted his tie, seeming strangely pleased with the situation. "I already have a team in London working on contingency solutions, but I thought I should bring the news personally, considering the gravity." For the next hour, they intensely discussed the data and possible approaches. Victoria remained unusually silent, absorbing the information and mentally formulating hypotheses. "We need time to fully analyze this data," Edward finally concluded. "Richard, how long will you be in Farnborough?" 3 days. I return to London on Tuesday." "Well, then we have 3 days to find a solution," Edward declared, his tone making it clear that he would not accept failure. When Richard left, Theo turned to Victoria, who continued to study the graphs with unusual intensity. "What are you seeing?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet," she replied slowly. "But something in this data doesn't seem natural." "What do you mean?" "The structural degradation curve is too linear for a phenomenon of this type. In real situations, we usually see more chaotic or exponential patterns." Edward approached, intrigued. "Are you suggesting the data might be incorrect?" "Not exactly," Victoria pondered, "but perhaps the testing method or the interpretation of the results is biased." The three worked late into the night, analyzing every aspect of Richard's reports. When they finally decided to take a break, Edward suggested they continue the next morning. "Theo, take Victoria home. Both of you need to rest to think clearly tomorrow." In the car, silence weighed heavily between them. Theo's confession at the Aero Club now seemed distant, overshadowed by the professional crisis. "I'm sorry for the interruption today," he finally said, as he drove through the quiet streets. "At the Aero Club, I was saying that—" "I know," Victoria replied softly. "And I feel the same." Theo briefly averted his eyes from the road, meeting her gaze. "Really? Really? But now we have a bigger problem to solve." Upon arriving at Victoria's apartment, she surprised him with a request. "Can you stay a little longer? I have a theory about this data that I'd like to discuss." Inside the apartment, Victoria quickly transformed the living room into an improvised workspace. On the blackboard, she began to draw equations and diagrams, explaining her reasoning. If we apply Fourier analysis to the reported vibration patterns, we see something curious, she explained, tracing complex curves. This specific signature does not correspond to a natural structural failure. Theo watched, fascinated by the brilliant mind working before him. So what would it be? It looks more like induced interference, as if... She hesitated, realizing the implication. As if someone was deliberately causing the anomaly during the tests, Theo completed, alarmed. Victoria nodded slowly. I don't want to accuse anyone without concrete evidence, but mathematically, that's the most coherent explanation. Would Richard bring falsified data? Not necessarily falsified, perhaps just collected under artificially manipulated conditions. They worked until dawn, developing their theory and planning how to prove their suspicions. When they finally finished, they were exhausted, but confident they had found something crucial. We need to rerun the tests tomorrow, following the agency's exact protocol, but with our own observation team, Victoria concluded. Theo smiled, admiring her deeply. You're incredible, you know. I'm just doing my job, she replied modestly. No, it's more than that. He approached, taking her hands in his. It's the way you see the world, as a problem that can be solved, no matter how complex it seems. The moment that followed was as inevitable as the law of gravity. Theo leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wished. Victoria, however, moved towards him, and their lips met in a soft, exploratory kiss. When they parted, both smiled, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just the beginning of something personal. It was a partnership on all levels. Intellectual, professional, emotional. We should get some sleep, she whispered. Tomorrow we have a mystery to solve and a plane to save. And after that? Theo asked, still holding her hands. Victoria smiled, the golden bracelet on her wrist catching the light of the room. After that, we have a future to build. The next morning dawned filled with tension. Victoria and Theo arrived early at the company, determined to prove their theory before the meeting with Richard and Edward. In the lab, they quickly set up an experiment to simulate the exact conditions of the tests conducted in London. If I'm right, Victoria explained, configuring the equipment, there should be specific interference causing an anomalous reading in the pressure sensors. Theo, who had spent the night on Victoria's sofa after working late, was still processing the events of the previous night, both the professional discovery and the personal moment they shared. How are we going to prove this to Richard? We need to document every step of the experiment. If he's intentionally manipulating the data, we'll have evidence. They worked methodically, video recording the entire procedure. After 3 hours of rigorous testing, the result was clear. Under normal conditions, the Phoenix structure maintained perfect integrity. Only when they introduced a specific pattern of electromagnetic interference, coincidentally present in the testing equipment used in London, did the sensors record the structural failure indicated in Richard's reports. That's it, Theo concluded, observing the results identical to those presented the day before. The structure isn't failing. It's the testing equipment that's inducing a false reading. Victoria nodded, checking the final data. We need to present this carefully. Accusing a company director of sabotage, even if indirect, is serious. Do you think it was intentional? She pondered for a moment. Not necessarily deliberate malice. It could be that Richard was so focused on finding problems that he overlooked the possibility of flaws in the testing procedure. Or perhaps he was trying to delay the project to have more time in London, Theo suggested, knowing Richard's preference for his operation in the capital. When they entered the meeting room, Edward was already there, as were Richard and 3 members of the London team. The atmosphere was tense, as if everyone was prepared for bad news. We analyzed the data overnight, Theo began, after everyone had settled, and we have a conclusion we believe to be important. Victoria took the floor, presenting with impeccable technical precision the results of their experiments. Using the room's screens, she showed comparative graphs, spectral analyses of the interferences, and finally the video documenting how they managed to reproduce exactly the reported phenomenon. The problem is not the Phoenix's structure, she concluded confidently. It's the electromagnetic interference from the testing equipment interacting with our state-of-the-art sensors. The equipment is calibrated for conventional sensors, but ours are based on nanotechnology with much higher sensitivity. Richard Alistair visibly paled, nervously flipping through his notes. This is a serious accusation, Ms. Nash. Are you suggesting we falsified data? No, she replied firmly. I am stating that the testing method is producing an erroneous result. The question of interpreting that result is another discussion. Edward, who had followed the presentation with silent attention, intervened. Richard, did your team check for possible equipment interference? Well, we followed the regulatory agency's standard protocol, he replied defensively. That doesn't answer my question, Edward insisted. The silence that followed was answer enough. I propose the following, Edward continued after a moment. We will redo the official tests tomorrow, with the presence of regulatory agency representatives, using both conventional equipment and a new set that eliminates the possibility of interference. If the problem persists, we will accept that there is a structural fault. If not, the project will proceed as planned. Richard had no way to refuse such a reasonable proposal. I agree, he murmured, avoiding looking directly at Victoria. The tests were carried out the next morning under the supervision of 3 technicians from the regulatory agency. As Victoria and Theo had predicted, the results with the modified equipment showed perfect structural integrity. The Phoenix was approved to proceed to the next certification phase without delays. The technical victory was discreetly celebrated by the team, but for Victoria, it represented much more than the success of a project. It was the definitive confirmation of her worth as an engineer, of her ability to overcome not only technical problems, but also personal obstacles that had threatened to destroy her career. That afternoon, Edward convened a special meeting in the main auditorium. Employees from all departments attended, curious about the sudden announcement. Victoria, using her crutches and visibly stronger after weeks of physical therapy, sat in the front row beside Theo. As everyone knows, Edward began, the Phoenix project represents the future of Mendoza Aerospace. Today I have 2 important pieces of news to share. The audience fell completely silent. First, after yesterday's successful tests, we received preliminary certification from the regulatory agency today. The Phoenix is officially on schedule for its inaugural flight in 3 months. Enthusiastic applause filled the auditorium. Second piece of news, Edward continued when the noise subsided. I am announcing a structural reorganization within the company. Richard Alistair will remain as director in London, with an exclusive focus on production. The Research and Development Division will now be led by a new director here in Farnborough. Eyes turned to Theo, the natural successor, but Edward smiled. I am pleased to announce Victoria Nash as our new Director of Research and Development. A murmur of surprise swept through the auditorium, followed by applause that slowly grew into an ovation. Theo was the first to stand, his face radiant with genuine pride. Victoria, astonished, stood up with the help of her crutches and walked to the stage. The symbolism was lost on no one. A few months ago, she had entered that company in a wheelchair, unemployed and without prospects. Now she walked on her own to assume one of the most important positions in the organization. Thank you, she began when the applause subsided. When I first entered the Mendoza Aerospace hangar, I wasn't looking for a position or recognition. I was looking for reconnection with my passion for engineering. Her voice, initially hesitant, gained strength as she continued. What I found was more than a professional opportunity. I found a place where talent is valued above circumstances, where innovation knows no barriers. I promise to honor this culture and expand the horizons of what we can achieve together. Edward, visibly moved, handed her an official badge with her new title. At that moment, Victoria felt the weight of the golden bracelet on her wrist, the symbol that had accompanied her journey of redemption. 6 weeks later, the Phoenix project was rapidly advancing to its final phase. The improvements proposed by Victoria had not only corrected the initial problems, but had elevated the aircraft's performance beyond the original specifications. The international aerospace industry was already commenting on the British miracle that was about to revolutionize the executive jet market. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Victoria and Theo walked through Wright Park, near the company. She used only a light cane now, progress that doctors considered extraordinary. Can you believe that in just 2 weeks we'll have the first official test flight? Theo commented, holding her free hand. It still feels like a dream, Victoria admitted. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'll find myself again in the small apartment in Satellite Gardens, with no prospects. Theo stopped, turning to face her. It wasn't luck or chance that brought you here, Victoria. It was your talent, your perseverance. You rebuilt your life. She smiled, touching the golden bracelet. I had help. Your father, you, and maybe a little magic from this bracelet. Speaking of which, Theo seemed suddenly nervous. There's something I want to ask you about it. Victoria observed him with curiosity. What is it? My father told me about the meaning of this bracelet to my mother, how she believed in second chances in rebirths. He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. He also told me he said he was just lending you the bracelet. Yes, she confirmed. I always knew that one day I'd have to return it. Actually, Theo continued, pulling a small box from his pocket, he had another plan. When he opened the box, Victoria saw a delicate engagement ring with a small wing-shaped diamond. Her eyes widened in understanding. My father believes, and so do I, that this bracelet found its true home, Theo explained, his voice choked with emotion. Just as you found your place in our lives. Tears began to form in Victoria's eyes as he knelt before her, holding her free hand. Victoria Nash, you've transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. You taught me that true engineering isn't just about building machines, but about rebuilding possibilities. He paused, smiling nervously. Would you do me the honor of building our future together? Marry me? The words were momentarily caught in Victoria's throat, overcome by emotion. Finally, she managed to reply, yes, 1,000 times yes. When Theo slid the ring onto her finger, next to the golden bracelet, Victoria felt a cycle complete. From a forgotten engineer in a wheelchair to a respected director about to marry the man she loved, her life had taken off in ways she never imagined possible. The wedding, held 3 months later in Mendoza Aerospace's main hangar, was an event that blended the personal and the professional in unique ways. The ceremony coincided with the official public presentation of the E-30 Phoenix, symbolizing the rebirth not only of a revolutionary aircraft, but also of a brilliant engineer who had almost lost her wings. Edward Mendoza walked Victoria down the makeshift aisle between rows of guests, Eliza's golden bracelet, now accompanied by her wedding band. Company employees, aviation authorities, journalists, and family members watched, moved, as she walked without any support. A personal achievement few had believed possible. I'm not just giving you to my son, Edward whispered as they walked, but to the family my wife and I built. You're not just my chief engineer, you're the daughter Eliza always wished she had. At the makeshift altar, with the imposing Phoenix as a backdrop, Theo waited with eyes bright with emotion. The ceremony, conducted by a family friend who was a judge, was brief but intense. When they exchanged rings, the setting sun streamed through the hangar windows, illuminating the couple with an orange glow that seemed to reflect the name of the aircraft that had brought them together. 2 years later, Mendoza Aerospace's headquarters in Farnborough received a special visitor. In Victoria's arms, little Edward, named in honor of his grandfather, watched with curious eyes the airplane models in his mother's office. At 9 months old, he already showed a fascination for anything that flew. He has the same inquisitive eyes as you, Theo commented, entering the room with technical blueprints for the company's newest project. Victoria smiled, adjusting her son on her lap, and the same stubbornness as his father and grandfather. Little Edward grabbed the golden bracelet on his mother's wrist, fascinated by the metal's shine. This bracelet has an incredible story, my love, Victoria murmured to her son. One day, I'll tell you how it helped your mother find her wings again. Outside the window, an E-30 Phoenix took off for another demonstration flight. The executive jet, now in regular production, had revolutionized the market, firmly placing Mendoza Aerospace on the global map of high-tech aviation. Victoria watched the aircraft ascend gracefully against the blue sky, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her there. From invisibility to recognition, from a wheelchair to independence, from loneliness to love, every step had been proof that talent and determination can indeed overcome the most difficult adversities. What are you thinking about? Theo asked, noticing her contemplative gaze. About how life sometimes tests us to make us stronger, she replied, hugging her son with one arm and extending the other to her husband. About how the obstacles that seem to bring us down can, in fact, teach us to fly higher. Edward Sr., now semi-retired but still chairman of the board, appeared at the door with an envelope in his hands. "Sorry to interrupt the family moment, but I just received news that couldn't wait." Theo and Victoria turned curious. "The Department for Science and Technology has just announced this year's National Innovation Award winners," he continued, unfolding the document from the envelope. "And the winner in the aerospace engineering category is Victoria Nash Mendoza for the development of the E-30 Phoenix integrated system." Little Edward, as if understanding the importance of the moment, clapped his hands enthusiastically, making the adults laugh. Victoria hugged her son and husband, her eyes welling up. "They say the award is the highest recognition for a British engineer," Edward Sr. commented. "But I think the real prize is seeing what you've built. Not just a revolutionary airplane, but a family, a career, a life that inspires others." That night, after putting her son to sleep, Victoria sat on her home's balcony, contemplating the starry sky. The golden bracelet on her wrist caught the moonlight, as it had so often caught the light of hope in moments of darkness. "Thank you, Eliza," she whispered to the sky. "Your bracelet truly restored broken wings." A gentle breeze blew, swaying the airplane mobiles in the baby's room. Through the open window, Victoria could hear the soft tinkling, like a distant applause of approval coming from somewhere beyond the stars. Dear listeners, we hope Victoria's inspiring journey has touched your hearts and shown that, even in the most challenging moments, there is always the possibility to rewrite our own story. To continue experiencing exciting stories like this, we have a special playlist with other narratives of triumph and new beginnings. Find it by clicking here. If this story of fresh starts and second chances resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the incredible human capacity to rise from adversity. Share in the comments which moment in Victoria's story touched your heart the most and what other inspiring stories you would like to hear on our channel.